I want to first start off by thanking all of you for sharing a part of your day with me. And I'm fighting a little bit of a cold, so I will hope you will excuse my use of cough drops as we go along. And as a disclaimer, I'm going to say his a lot today, although I have some examples of when the gaslighter is actually a female. However, we know that the preponderance of domestic violence is male to female, so I may fall into that a bit. So let's talk about, and also I'm a sociologist rather than a psychologist. So my plan today is to start macro, go micro, and then talk about tactics used by gaslighters, and then how we can help victims become survivors. So the origin of the term gaslighting is from a play in 1938, which became a movie in 1944. And the plot involves a man attempting to make his wife believe that she's going insane. And he's up in the attic, he's searching for her jewels, which is why he married her. And the lights in the house, which were run by gas, dim. And he insists to her that they're not dimming and she can't, not really in the attic. This is all in her mind. And I encourage you, if you've never taken a look at the trailer for this movie, it's very 1940s dramatic, and it all ends well in the end, but it's pretty entertaining to watch. If you Google movies and gaslighting, there's a whole host of current movies that involve gaslighting, such as The Girl on the Train, The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, The Invisible Man, The Changeling. So it's easy to watch some examples from the big screen. In 2022, not 1922, in 2022, gaslighting was actually the Merriam-Webster word of the year. And it was noted that during that year that there was a 1,740% increase in lookups of that term. So let's start big. When I first started learning and thinking about gaslighting, I realized as a sociologist that the sociological literature was way ahead of the psychological literature in terms of studying gaslighting. And if I had more time, I could go into medical gaslighting and workplace gaslighting and institutional gaslighting and all sorts of things. But I thought we'd start off with one that, as an American, I think it's actually kind of humorous to think about. Has anyone ever heard the phrase fake news? That's a good example. If you look down here in the US to the South, you can actually go to one channel and listen to very authoritative people, great credentials, experience, whatever. They paint a picture of reality that looks X. You change the channel and you go to another channel, also very credible, authoritative, experienced folks, and the reality is completely different. And if you get people from the two sides onto the same platform, they'll call each other liars and misleading, and what they're doing is wrong, and it's, I'm going to use this word later, but it's crazy making to watch it. And I'm using the political example because there are some studies that that were done after the 2020 election. And one study found, not surprisingly, that the term gaslighting on social media platforms spiked during the week of the election. And one study in particular by Shane et al., and if anybody wants any of the sites that I throw out, please email me. They looked at gaslighting and the spread of disinformation on X and 4chan. And they came up with I think, very applicable for the family, these ideas that discussions that were on those channels could be self-sealing or self-fulfilling about the anxieties of the people who were engaging them. Self-sealing discussions involve the accusers insulating themselves from correction and dispute. So think about it. If night after night you're listening to commentators and authority figures and they assert a body of evidence is not credible, there's no credible scientific evidence that climate change is occurring. Has anyone ever heard that? And if you hear that night after night after night, and that's all you hear, it becomes self-sealing. It becomes what you're comfortable with. Or another example might be testimony by or statements by someone in authority that certain groups, the news media, immigrants, lots of different examples, can't be trusted. So again, think about hearing that night after night. Now self-fulfilling discussions are ones where people who are generally in these self-sealing groups they're looking for examples which fulfill what they're thinking. They're looking for evidence that the climate isn't changing. They're looking for how immigrants or the news media can be discredited. And another interesting study by Wu and Mustafa in 2023 found that they were studying the exposure of people on social media to statements about COVID-19. And they found that the intentional exposure to certain platforms, which reinforced the person's belief, tended to act as confirmation bias in the belief in the fake news. Whereas if you're switching back and forth between these channels and you're going to a variety of different places, not so much is that going to happen. So that's the macro level, what's going on up here. But let's move closer to home. Let's think about the community level, about how this can take part. Now, third parties, think about school officials, think about people involved in activities, religious leaders. They have the power to intervene in a relationship where they can observe that someone is being gaslit. They may question the narrative. They may point out that things are not true, but they also may ignore the situation because it's uncomfortable to get in the middle of it. And in my experience as a custody evaluator, by the time people get to me, oftentimes two groups within the same community will have polarized around each parent, creating self-sealing discussions and looking for self-fulfilling examples of what their belief of reality is. Let's funnel down a little more to extended families. I found when I do custody evaluations, I not only talk to professionals like schools and therapists and whatnot, but I also ask for statements from ancillary sources, people like friends and family and whatnot. And what I'm finding more and more over time, and I think as things get more polarized in the US, I found that extended families and tight-knit friend groups can engage in that same kind of self-sealing and self-fulfilling behavior, where I'll read the statements written by the extended family, and you can just feel the pain and the anger ooze out of those people. And then I think about, well, if that's what the parent hears over and over and over, what else is the parent going to believe? Let's funnel down a little further to the family. I'm going to be talking mostly about gaslighting as occurring between parents or between partners. But I think we should also, I think we're going to become increasingly aware of parents gaslighting children, because by definition, there's a power imbalance between the parental and child subsystems. And if someone is willing to manipulate a partner or spouse, why should we not consider that behavior will be replicated within the parental-child subsystem? Because children, particularly young children, they view their parents as all-powerful and all-knowing, and they're isolated. Think about between partners. Well, we typically think that domestic violence victims may have become isolated from systems which might give them support. Well, young children can be isolated and have no external reality other than what is being told to them by their parents until they go to school And how often, if you're a clinician if you're, we'll just leave it at that, if you're a clinician, how often have you seen children come into the school setting and realizing there are other truths other than what's being practiced or told at home? And I'm thinking primarily of children who have been physically or verbally abused, but I think practices can be viewed that way. Variance in family structure, differences in practices and realities. It's really eye-opening to children to go into a bigger pool and see that not everyone is the same. I'd also like to throw out one interesting study by Lee and Samp in 2023 that looked at gaslighting within individuals who are LGBTQ+. And what they found was, it made sense once I read it, but what they found is that people who have an affirmative identity, they're comfortable in their own skin, reported less gaslighting. But people who didn't have that were much more susceptible to overt gaslighting tactics from within their family members who may not be comfortable with their identity. And fathers, I'm not surprised about this, but fathers were identified as the most typical gaslighters, followed by mothers, male friends, and finally female friends. So there's something else to think about. So let's think about, what is gaslighting? So again, the Merriam-Webster definition was the act or practice of grossly misleading someone, especially for their own advantage. Gaslighting employs, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but gaslighting employs misdirection, distraction, the deliberate denial of reality based upon one partner wielding power and control over another. And the distinctive feature of gaslighting is that it's not enough for the gaslighter to simply control his or her victim and have things go away, his or her way, excuse me. It's essential that the victim come to agree with the abuser, come to view herself or himself as really not capable of having an autonomous locus of control of thought or judgment. So changing the narrative is the overarching goal of the gaslighter. But I'd like you to think of the victim as being trapped in or caged in the gaslighter's narrative. The gaslighter is hoping that the victim will come to trust herself as crazy or oversensitive. And when I think of that particular aspect about it, I think of several families I've worked with in which the perpetrator would come home and come through the door and say, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And eventually the victim began to experience anticipatory anxiety, knowing that that was going to be the question of what's wrong, what's happening, and started to search for the self-fulfilling example of what's gone wrong today. And I used to call it crazy making behavior, but it's really gaslighting. So how does the process of gaslighting work? Well, criticisms intensify over time and focus on increasingly minor issues or mistakes. So the victim is first told, you can't handle money, or you don't understand money, or whatever. And particularly with financial abuse, I think it funnels down to where people are being given money, but not quite enough money, or they're expected to account, I've given you $20. What exactly did you do with every penny in that? The victim's memory is questioned. That's a very common pattern. From going from, are you sure? To, you never remember things, and examples of when you didn't remember things. The victim's feelings are trivialized from, you're being oversensitive, you're overreacting. You shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't feel that way. The victim is often told as things progress, that didn't happen. What you're sure happened, that didn't happen. And as Lori was saying in the beginning, prove to me that it did happen. And if you're looking for the receipt, you might not have it. If you're looking for someone to confirm what you saw, maybe people don't want to get involved. And the more that happens, the more the victim begins to doubt his or her own ability to make, to capture reality. I also think we should think about the use of stereotypes for race, ethnicity, and gender as being a powerful tool of a gaslighter to cause the victim to question his or her own view of reality. A study done by, pardon me, my computer's making noises, by Sweet in 2019 looked at gaslighting and concluded that social inequalities, including gender, were very powerful. So think stereotypes. Perpetrators mobilize gender-based stereotypes and structural and institutional inequalities against the victim to manipulate their reality. So an example of that from my own practice is I was evaluating family, both parents very competent, served in the military, wouldn't think either of them would be questioning their own reality. But the mother ended up staying at home with the children for a variety of reasons. And as she became more isolated, he began to throw out stereotypes at her. He was Caucasian and she was Hispanic. And he would say to her things like, well, women do the cleaning. I'm not going to help because women are supposed to engage in housework, which is, oh no, I think it's a garden. And clean the yard. I'm not going to help you with yard work. So she was home and isolated with her family and began to believe his reality. And it wasn't until she was visited by a friend who knew both of them and had previously worked with them and said, what's going on with this? Why would you believe that this is happening? And when I asked him about this, he said, well, I was only joking. He didn't even deny it. He said it was a joke. So that victim accepted his version of reality and began to constantly apologize. And I would encourage you, if you're a clinician or counsel, if someone is beginning most of their statements with, I'm sorry, that's a good hint that someone has been trained to say that, trained to apologize for his or her view of reality, and has been caused to become increasingly crazy, feeling crazy, and unable to make decisions. And I think people, the first time they encounter the legal system, they may appear to be, because of their view that they can't make decisions, they may appear to be less functional. So let's look at gaslighting as a form of coercive control, a form of domestic violence. And I think it's perhaps one of the most damaging and insidious, but subtle forms of coercive control, because it can be, it can work in a variety of ways, but it can be a continued pattern of the power imbalance which existed during the relationship. That is very tricky to work with because an outsider, I don't feel, I would not mediate a case where there's been a allegation of coercive control or gaslighting, because I don't know what the phrase is that triggers the victim. I don't know what parts of the reality of the victim has been questioned. And I don't know where the reality of the victim and the reality of the abuser, I don't know where those things start and stop. All I know is that victims have come to trust themselves and not trust themselves. And oftentimes when they're challenged in a stressful situation, like in the courtroom, like during a custody evaluation, like during a mediation session, particularly if they don't have an advocate, they may go to what they've been trained to accept as reality. I'm just going to accept what that person says and go with that, and that's how I'll make my decision. I also think that the coercive control and the gaslighting can be something which has evolved since separation. And that occurs particularly if there's high conflict and continued litigation. And I'm thinking about a case that I had where I believe that during the parties were married, during the marriage, I believe there was physical violence by the father. That had stopped, and the parties had engaged in ongoing litigation and had a child who was on the spectrum, had needed lots of support. And by the time they came to me, the pattern that was observable was that the father would become volatile and would explode at care providers, explode at teachers, explode at mother. But when I dug down into the roots of things, I realized that the explosion happened after mother started emailing the professionals. And what she would do is she would cut and paste emails. And they didn't look, they would be portions of the discussions by professionals and by father and whatnot. And it wasn't until after I realized that, well, there's no header on this email, or the lines on the side which tell you where you are in the email, they were different. And I started asking the father for copies of the entire discussion. I could see why he was spending a huge amount of his day trying to prove what she was doing. And again, her response to that, much like it was a joke, was, well, I'm just trying to make it easier for everyone. So she was writing that off. So what types of behavior should you look for in association with gaslighting? Well, there may be some sidestepping, dodging the evidence that supports the victim's belief or thoughts. Very frequently, you'll find that information is being withheld, such as not letting, again, financial abuse is easier to see sometimes. The victim may not know about accounts or may not know how much is in the account. And then when the account becomes overdrawn, then the victim is told that he or she is irresponsible. Providing incorrect information, again, the woman who was editing emails to make the other parent look crazy. Redirecting or recharacterizing opinions. Particularly, I find this happens with authority figures like the pediatrician. Everybody will be pointing towards what the pediatrician's, not everybody, the gaslighter will be pointing towards what the pediatrician says. And as the victim becomes less functional, he or she may not reach out to the pediatrician. The pediatrician may be told on the side by the abuser that there are some problems with the other parents. But the pediatrician or the school teacher is the one that's pointed to as justifying the particular narrative. Trivializing, again, we've talked about this, that the victim's feelings or view is considered to be less important. Displacing, attributing something to a cognitive defect. You never could remember numbers. I'm going to keep track of the finances because you can't remember things. Denial. I recently was involved in a case where there were police reports documenting certain things, statements by third parties. The parent continued to state that what had happened hadn't happened and held on to that. And projecting and blaming. Again, another case I'm thinking of where both parents are videoing each other as a way of substantiating his or her version of reality. And one parent, the father, said that the mother was projecting everything onto him and that he was the one that was being victimized. And they actually both gave me a video where she decided to record herself having breakfast because there had been problems with that. He starts recording her and gets within a few inches of her and says to her, if you would only realize what you're doing is so abusive, I would turn off my phone. And I wonder why she would question her own reality. How can we turn victims into survivors? I like to start with recommendations of books and articles. There's a bevy of books, journals available on Amazon and your local bookstore. I also think it's imperative for mental health and counsel, mental health professionals and counsel, to talk to the abuser about the potential consequences of continuing to engage in the behavior. In California, where I'm at, coercive control is actually, it's written in as a type of domestic violence, and that varies widely throughout different jurisdictions. But the abuser needs to know that there may be some consequences for continuing to engage in the behavior. I think helping both the abuser and the victim focus on the description of what is actually happening. As Lori pointed out, people will come into my office, oh, I'm being gaslit. But they don't really know what that necessarily is. It's a term that people like to throw around. In terms of treatment, folks need to be assessed initially for things like PTSD and anxiety and depression. And they need to help identify for themselves what the specific techniques are being used against them and identify triggers which cause them to become anxious. They need to learn to challenge the narrative of what's being told to them. They need to help find objective facts, objective evidence. Look at your child's report card. Don't tell me you don't know how to help your child with homework. The report card is great. Victims need to be given permission to stop questioning thoughts and feelings, kind of like thought stopping plus. So, some people refer to that as narrative replacement or repair, where they begin to think, I do know how to do this. I do know. My reality is what really is happening. They need to develop plans for when the behavior occurs. And I think initially that is telling people it's okay to stop, to disengage, because it takes some strength to stand up against being gaslit. Giving people permission to not respond to an email or a message for so many hours. When people are going back and forth quickly, it's very hard to stay in control of the situation or feel like it's going as you think you should. Developing a plan to respond to the behavior. And I would encourage people, I've seen mental health folks say, well, we're going to role play and we're going to, when this is said, you're going to say this, it goes back and forth, but you can't really role play the whole argument. So I think that the survivor needs to be pretty strong before he or she engages in that. Self-care activities related to what's been undermined need to be identified. The survivor needs to cultivate supportive relationships, and that may be through extended family, that may be through community-based support. Think of what has occurred. Does this person need education, vocational assessment, exercise? What does that victim need to really be strong and become a survivor? And I could go on and on and on about this topic, and I could if you'd like me to, but I think I will turn it back over to Lori at this point.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Susan, for speaking about gaslighting from your perspective in California. So if anybody cannot hear me very well, just please let me know. Otherwise, I guess what I'd like to talk about is from the lawyer's perspective, dealing with gaslighting and mental health and psychological issues that clients deal with on a regular basis. So my perspective is more on a micro level. Susan started macro, and what my perspective is, at the end of the day, how will claims of gaslighting be viewed by the court? In other words, how will a court ultimately find the claim of gaslighting or a response to the claim of gaslighting, and what ultimately will be the result of that? And so, even though we're talking about gaslighting is more of part of a bigger picture of psychological issues from clients. Okay, and that was based in an article that I wrote with Dr. Erwin Butkowski that addressed more of the psychological issues in a more macro level, vis-a-vis psychological testing. And the ultimate findings from our research in that article is that even though people can make various claims throughout their family law litigation claims, but if what the courts will focus on, Sorry, I see that people are not hearing me properly. Let me just change my microphone. Okay, I think hopefully that will be better. Can everyone hear me now? I'm sorry about that. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. Fabulous. I like fabulous. And so what the courts look at is what is the impact on children of any psychological issues that are being raised, okay? And what that means is that when a client comes to a family lawyer and makes claims of, being gaslit or being, there's family violence by the other side, what a lawyer's job is to look at not just the personal effect of that incident, but also down the line, how will that be looked at by the court? And if there's minimal evidence, for example, for a certain claim, so our job as family lawyers would be to support the client emotionally and therapeutically by advising them to seek counselors to help them to become stronger through their process. But at the same time, balancing that with giving them a realistic expectation what could happen in court. Because Susan can probably attest to this. Family law court and litigation is very expensive as it is. And so if you lead a client astray by giving them a false hope or false expectation of how certain gaslighting claims may result in court, the client will not only potentially waste tens of thousands of dollars fighting in court, but also the result of the claims may not materialize in what they're expecting. And so the way that I think in general a family lawyer should approach this situation is that look at things holistically. In other words, what is the corroborating evidence that supports claims such as being gaslit? Are there witnesses that have seen the example of this? Is there, for example, text messages that supports claims like this? Are there any professionals that a client has spoken to about this? Is there any other sort of professional or not evidence that has examples of a person's abusive behavior, not just gaslighting? Because at least in Ontario courts and throughout Canada, in terms of family law decisions, gaslighting is put together as part of a bigger family violence spectrum. And so even though you may not have a very convincing evidence for gaslighting itself, but there could be other forms of abuse that there have stronger evidence. And therefore that can add to your client's credibility of their gaslighting claim, because it's part of a package that is founded by evidence. Okay, so that kind of put things in perspective. And so number one is the evidence. Okay, now, so number two is the effect of the children. So just because somebody is a horrible husband doesn't necessarily mean that he's a horrible father. Okay. I mean, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And that distinction is important because most of the time in family court, we're not talking about, a criminal level of evidence that we're trying to determine whether somebody did an act that requires some sort of criminal sanctions or not. Typically in family court, almost always, we're talking about, where will the children go? How long will they spend with each client? Decision making, will it be joint, will it be sole? So it's very much focused about the child. So when you have a client that claims of being gaslit along with other abuse, the question is, well, how does that level of abuse or gaslighting trickle down to the parenting level? And how will how will a child be affected by that? Because, for example, sometimes a person can act abusive towards the wife, but not necessarily for parenting purposes. In other words, sometimes the stress in a household prior to couples separating physically results in one or both parent acting in not their best selves, which sometimes results in physical or verbal abuse or mental abuse. But when they separate, at times it actually reduces the behavior. There are cases out there that I've read throughout Canada um, that where there were original claims of gaslighting and abuse, but then subsequently the father, for example, went to therapy, realized the effect of his behavior on the child and the mother, and took steps to become better parent, etc., etc. And the judge in that particular case recognized that and ultimately ordered that the parenting decision making be joint and that the parenting time be shared equally. Even though originally the client started with a lot of accusations against him, against the father, over the course of the separation and litigation, the father had improved. So, especially if you're starting the case in day one when you have an initial consultation and the client gives you a rundown of everything that's being happening, abusive or not, it's important for the lawyer to think about, well, 2, 3 years down the road, if it ever goes to trial, will that necessarily equate to a finding by the court that this gaslighting significantly impacts their ability to parent, and is it in stone? And a lot of times it's not. A lot of times people change for the better. However, if they don't, so then what you're looking for is a pattern of coercive control, a pattern of abuse, and therefore courts rarely look at individual incidences of gaslighting or abuse as enough to sway their opinion one way or another. They're looking at patterns, they're looking at evidence, they're looking at supportive evidence, and things like that. And so from my article of psychological testing that I did with Dr. Butkowski, there are a lot of parallels that affect gaslighting issues as well. And so, for example, the role of the court. Okay, so in a case of severe cases of abuse and gaslighting and things like that, a court, at least in certain jurisdictions, has the right to be able to order a parenting capacity assessment to be done, and which would include psychological testing. Because if you have an individual that has a propensity to be abusive and using all the different abusive tools, it would benefit the court if they see a parenting capacity assessment, which includes a psychological test component, which could fortify a psychologist's opinion or parenting capacity's opinion about this person. So it's important to understand the legal options that a client has when being abused by the various different means. And so the court has a lot of discretion and leniency with respect to these kind of issues. And it's important to have that in mind when you first start out the process. And again, as I mentioned before, corroborating evidence is very important because there are cases throughout Canada that even when a psychological test has shown one thing, but or even a parenting capacity assessor indicated one findings of an individual, let's say an abusive individual, or allegedly abusive, if you have corroborating evidence that goes against that, and a lot of it, sometimes courts have disregarded that assessment or findings because the evidence is overwhelmingly to the other showing something else. And so therefore, again, claims from clients from gaslighting, it will not be enough. As a lawyer, your job is to find corroborating evidence to make sure that the case is strong and your advice to the client is sound and plausible. And also another part, which is important that's found in the case law, is that predictions. You have to be careful about making predictions. In other words, just because a certain event happened doesn't mean it's going to continue to happen. And usually predictions, a lot of times predictions are wrong in many different spheres, including the legal sphere. And so when even an assessor or a professional makes a prediction that, well, this person will continue to gaslight in the future with the children or the parent, or they will continue to be abusive, you really have to take a step back and ask, well, on what basis are they making that? Is there enough evidence and historic facts to support that prediction? So that's very important. And then finally, in terms of the connection to the parenting ability, that's what needs to be thought about first and foremost. Once these claims of abuse occur, you have to also ask, how does that translate to a parenting plan? How does that translate to a person's ability to parent? Sometimes a person can be very narcissistic. But when it comes to themselves and let's say their spouse, but when it comes to children, that it has happened that narcissism has translated into a very positive focus of parenting the children. Not perfect, but at least on a weighing scale, a positive focus. And therefore, you have to think about, does this person gaslight? Is this person a narcissist that has narcissistic tendencies? But at the same time, how does that translate of him being a parent? Because because what you're trying to show on a legal context is how does that translate to positive or negative parenting? So if he's narcissistic, for example, to the extent of abusing the children or neglecting the children or manipulating the children or gaslighting the children as well, so then yes, you have a continuous flow of a claim of a person's personality disorder, for example, to ultimately a parenting plan. So again, you don't want a mere off one example. So that's not enough to convince a court. And so I understand that we wanted to kind of have half an hour of questions, so I'm going to just conclude here and ultimately open the floor to questions, because I think it may be more important for the listeners to learn from their own questions and hopefully the answers of Susan and I. So Laurie, thank you very much for giving me the time, and I'm opening myself to questions.